You watch others effortlessly persuade and influence, while your best arguments fall on deaf ears. Every day you present logical points and rational solutions, yet somehow others with less expertise get their ideas adopted, their proposals approved, their vision embraced. I am Niccolò Machiavelli, and I spent my life studying the hidden mechanics of human influence in the most dangerous arena of all Renaissance politics, where the wrong word could mean exile or death. For over 500 years, leaders have used my principles of psychological mastery to shape minds, move masses, and bend reality to their will. What I discovered about controlling minds will transform how you navigate every relationship and situation. The same strategies that helped princes rule kingdoms can help you master any room, win any negotiation, and make people genuinely want to follow your lead. But first, like this video, subscribe for more Machiavellian wisdom, and comment below. Where you're watching from, I want to see which corners of the world are ready for true influence, mastery. The Florentine seal once opened every door in the Republic. I carried it with absolute authority, a symbol of my position as secretary to the Ten of War. For 14 years, I wielded influence that shaped the destiny of Florence itself. Ambassadors sought my counsel, generals awaited my strategic guidance, and the most powerful families in Italy respected my political acumen. But power built on position alone is as fragile as morning mist. When the Medici returned to Florence in 1512, everything I had built crumbled in a single day. The seal that had been my key to influence became worthless metal. The title that commanded respect became a liability. Those who once hung on my every word now crossed the street to avoid being seen with me. I watched from my exile as lesser minds occupied positions of authority, making decisions that would have been unthinkable during my tenure. It was a bitter lesson, but perhaps the most valuable one I ever learned. True influence had nothing to do with titles, seals, or official positions. It resided in something far deeper and more permanent. In losing everything, I discovered what truly mattered: the ability to understand and guide human nature itself. The seal could be taken away, but the knowledge of how minds work, how people can be moved, how desires can be shaped, this was power that no political upheaval could touch. My fall from grace became my greatest teacher. It stripped away every external trapping of authority and forced me to examine what real influence looked like. While others built their power on shifting political sands, I began to construct mine on the bedrock of human psychology. The man who had once needed official sanction to command attention would learn to captivate minds through understanding alone. This was the beginning of my true education in the art of control. The iron shackles that bound my wrists taught me more about human control than all my years in diplomatic service. In the darkness of that Florence prison cell, accused of conspiracy against the Medici, I experienced psychological manipulation from the receiving end for the first time in my life. My captors were artists of mental pressure. They didn't simply interrogate me, they orchestrated my entire psychological experience. The timing of meals became irregular, creating uncertainty and dependence. Questions came at unexpected hours, disrupting any sense of mental preparation. They would show kindness one moment and cruelty the next, keeping me constantly off balance. But here's what fascinated me: they never needed to break my body to affect my mind. The threat of torture was more powerful than torture itself. The unknown was more terrifying than any known punishment. They understood that the human imagination, when properly guided, becomes their most effective tool of control. I began to observe my own responses with the detachment of a scholar studying a specimen. When did I feel most compliant? When did resistance surge within me? What techniques made me question my own certainty? What approaches made me want to cooperate rather than merely submit? During those long nights, listening to other prisoners, I realized that everyone had a breaking point not of pain, but of psychological pressure. Some cracked under isolation, others under uncertainty. Some needed to feel important, others needed to feel safe. The key was identifying which lever moved which person. The guards thought they were punishing me, but they were actually providing me with the most valuable education of my life. I was learning the architecture of mental control from the inside out, understanding how fear, hope, comfort, and discomfort could be weaponized. When I finally gained my freedom through a general amnesty, I walked out with something far more valuable than my liberty. I possessed first-hand knowledge of how minds could be captured, held, and directed. The shackles had been removed from my wrists, but I now understood how to place invisible ones on others. That prison experience became the foundation of everything I would later teach about influence and control. You cannot truly master others until you understand how you yourself can be mastered. Cesare Borgia's dagger was never far from his side, but it wasn't the blade that made him feared it, was the psychological warfare he wielded with surgical precision. I had the privilege of observing this master manipulator during my diplomatic missions, and what I witnessed changed my understanding of power forever. Borgia never needed to raise his voice to command a room. He had mastered the art of presence itself. He would enter negotiations with an air of casual confidence that suggested he already knew the outcome. His opponents would find themselves agreeing to terms they hadn't intended to accept, simply because Borgia made resistance feel futile rather than noble. I watched him turn enemies into allies through a technique I came to call strategic magnanimity. Instead of destroying defeated opponents, he would spare them in ways that created lasting obligation. These men would become more loyal than his natural allies, because they owed their very existence to his mercy. Lorenzo de' Medici operated differently but equally effectively. Where Borgia used controlled intimidation, Lorenzo wielded charm like a precision instrument. He had an uncanny ability to make every person feel like the most important individual in any gathering. He remembered details about people's families, their interests, their concerns, and would reference them months later as if these details occupied his thoughts daily. But here's what made Lorenzo truly masterful. He understood that people's greatest desire is to feel significant. He created elaborate social theater where others could play starring roles while he quietly directed the entire production. Men would compete for his approval without ever realizing they were being managed. Pope Alexander VI showed me how authority could be projected through ritualized behavior. Every action carried symbolic weight. The way he held audiences, the deliberate pace of his speech, the strategic use of silence, all of it reinforced his position without requiring explicit statements of power. What struck me about all these masters was their patience. None of them rushed to impose their will. Instead, they created conditions where others would naturally align with their desires. They understood that the most effective control is that which feels like choice. Each of these men had discovered that influence flows not from position or force, but from understanding the hidden motivations that drive human behavior. They had learned to speak the secret language of desire, fear, ambition, and pride that governs every interaction. Their techniques became my textbook. Their successes and failures became my case studies. From their examples, I began to construct a systematic approach to psychological influence that could be learned, practiced, and perfected. The Venetian looking glass in my study taught me one of the most powerful principles of human influence. People are irresistibly drawn to those who reflect their deepest desires back to them. Just as we cannot help but look at our own reflection, humans cannot resist engaging with someone who seems to understand and embody what they most want to become. I discovered this principle by accident during a negotiation with a Florentine merchant who was notorious for his impossible demands. Instead of arguing with his positions, I began to mirror his concerns. When he spoke of fairness, I spoke of justice. When he mentioned his reputation, I emphasized honor. When he worried about his family's future, I reflected those same anxieties. Something remarkable happened. He began to see me not as an opponent, but as someone who truly understood his world. Within hours, he had agreed to terms that were far more favorable to my position than his own, and he felt good about it. This wasn't mere agreement or compliance. I had become what he needed to see in that moment. I had held up a psychological mirror that showed him his own values, concerns, and aspirations reflected back in a way that made cooperation feel natural and right. The key is identifying what people truly desire versus what they claim to want. Most individuals will tell you they want success, respect, or security. But dig deeper and you'll discover they actually crave significance, recognition, or certainty. They want to feel chosen, understood, or vindicated. They need to believe their struggles have meaning, their opinions matter, or their fears are justified. I developed a simple method for this discovery. I listen not just to what people say, but to how they say it. What topics make their voices change? What subjects cause them to lean forward or pull back? What words do they repeat? What stories do they tell about themselves? What complaints reveal their hidden wishes? Once I understand these deeper currents, I become fluent in speaking their internal language. I don't pretend to share their interests, so I reflect their underlying emotional needs. If someone needs to feel important, I create opportunities for them to demonstrate expertise. If they need to feel secure, I emphasize stability and reliability. If they need to feel understood, I share experiences that parallel their struggles. This isn't manipulation through deception. It's influence through genuine recognition of what matters to them. I'm not lying about who I am. I'm emphasizing the aspects of myself that resonate with their deepest needs. The most powerful application of this principle is making people feel seen in ways they rarely experience. Most individuals go through life feeling misunderstood or overlooked. When you become the rare person who truly recognizes their inner world, you create a psychological bond that transcends logical agreement or disagreement. They will seek your company not because you agree with them, but because, in your presence, they feel like the best version of themselves. The Medici lion adorned their coat of arms not by accident, but as a perfect symbol of the balance between respected strength and beloved protection. I have been much quoted on this principle. It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. But what most people miss is the psychological sophistication required to apply this formula correctly. Fear without respect becomes tyranny, which inevitably breeds rebellion. Love without boundaries becomes weakness, which invites exploitation. The art lies in calibrating these forces to create what I call respectful devotion, where others choose to follow you because they simultaneously admire your strength and trust your benevolence. I learned this through observing my own responses to different leaders. Those who ruled through fear alone created an environment where I complied but never truly supported their vision. I waited for opportunities to undermine them. Conversely, leaders who were only kind and accommodating lost my respect. I began to see them as obstacles rather than guides. But there were rare individuals who commanded both my loyalty and my caution. They had clear boundaries that I didn't dare cross, but within those boundaries, they showed genuine care for my welfare and development. I found myself wanting to exceed their expectations, not from fear of punishment, but from desire to prove worthy of their investment in me. The key is understanding when to deploy each approach. Fear works best for establishing non-negotiable standards and boundaries. It should be used sparingly but decisively. When someone violates a core principle or crosses a clearly established line, swift and proportionate consequences demonstrate that your standards aren't suggestions. However, fear must never be your primary tool. It should be like a sharp knife, in your kitchen, present when needed, but not constantly displayed. Most of your influence should flow through what I call elevated love, showing people that you see their potential and are invested in helping them achieve it. This means celebrating their victories, acknowledging their growth, and creating opportunities for them to succeed. But it also means holding them accountable to higher standards than they might set for themselves. True care sometimes requires difficult conversations and challenging expectations. I've observed that people actually crave this combination. They want to follow someone strong enough to maintain order and direction, but compassionate enough to care about their individual journey. They want to feel both protected and challenged, both supported and held accountable. The fatal error is hatred. Never allow your use of appropriate consequences to create genuine animosity. When you must be firm, frame it as protection of the standards that benefit everyone, not as personal punishment. Make it clear that you're enforcing principles, not expressing displeasure with them as individuals. People will forgive firmness that serves a greater purpose, but they will never forgive cruelty that serves only your ego. The moment your leadership becomes about dominance rather than development, you've lost the moral authority that makes influence sustainable. Master this balance, and you'll find that people compete for your approval while respecting your judgment, creating a dynamic where your influence grows stronger over time rather than requiring constant maintenance. The broken crown taught me more about power than any intact symbol of authority ever could. During my years of exile, I discovered that showing calculated weakness often creates unexpected strength, while projecting invulnerability makes you a target that others cannot wait to test. I learnt this lesson painfully when I first attempted to rebuild my influence after my political downfall. I tried to project the same unshakable confidence that had served me in my official position. People responded with skepticism and resistance. They were waiting for me to fail, eager to prove that my confidence was merely arrogance in disguise. Everything changed when I made a strategic decision to acknowledge my vulnerabilities openly. Instead of pretending that my exile hadn't affected me, I spoke candidly about the lessons learned through loss. Rather than claiming to have all the answers, I admitted where my understanding remained incomplete. The response was immediate and powerful. People who had been suspicious of my motives began to trust my judgment. Those who had seemed determined to challenge me started seeking my counsel. By showing that I was human rather than infallible, I had become someone they could relate to and learn from. But here's the crucial distinction. Strategic vulnerability is not the same as weakness or oversharing. It's the calculated revelation of specific imperfections that actually strengthen your position rather than undermine it. Discovered that certain types of vulnerability create psychological bonds while others create exploitation opportunities. Admitting past mistakes in judgment makes you appear wise and reflective. Acknowledging areas where you're still growing makes you seem authentic and relatable. Sharing struggles that others have experienced makes you feel approachable and understanding. However, revealing current insecurities about your competence makes people question your abilities. Exposing ongoing personal dramas makes you seem unstable. Confessing weaknesses that directly relate to your primary responsibilities creates doubt about your fitness for leadership. The key is choosing vulnerabilities that humanize you without undermining your core value proposition. If you're known for strategic thinking, you can admit to struggles with interpersonal relationships. If you're valued for your compassion, you can acknowledge challenges with maintaining boundaries. If you're respected for your technical expertise, you can reveal difficulties with public speaking. I also learned that timing matters enormously. Vulnerability shared after establishing competence creates trust. Vulnerability shared before proving value creates doubt. People need to believe in your strengths before they can appreciate your honest acknowledgement of limitations. The The most powerful application of this principle is in conflict resolution. When someone challenges your position or questions your decision, the natural impulse is to defend and justify. But I discovered that acknowledging partial validity in their concern, while maintaining your core position, often transforms opposition into collaboration. Instead of saying you're wrong about this, I learned to say, I can see why you might think that, and there's some validity to your concern. Let me share how I've weighed that factor against these other considerations. This approach makes people feel heard and respected, while allowing you to guide them toward your perspective. Strategic vulnerability isn't about revealing everything about yourself. It's about revealing the right things at the right times too. Create the relationships and responses that serve your larger purpose. The merchant's ledger on my desk tracks more than financial transactions, maps the flow of information through human networks, revealing who knows what, when they learned it, and how they're likely to use it. I discovered early in my career that information is the ultimate currency of influence, more valuable than gold because it creates the conditions where gold naturally flows. Most people think of information as simply facts to be shared or withheld, but I learned to view it as a strategic resource that must be carefully cultivated, precisely targeted, and systematically deployed to create desired outcomes. The person who controls information flow controls the decisions that follow. During my diplomatic years, I observed how the same piece of information could serve completely different purposes depending on when and how it was revealed. A treaty negotiation could be swayed by sharing intelligence about an enemy's weakness at exactly the right moment. A political alliance could be forged by revealing a mutual threat, just as tensions were rising, but the real power came from understanding that people make decisions based not on complete information, but on the information available to them at the moment of choice. By controlling what they know and when they know it, I could guide their thinking toward conclusions that served my purposes, while allowing them to feel they had arrived at these decisions independently. I developed what I call the information dependency system. Instead of hoarding knowledge, I became the reliable source that others learned to consult before making important decisions. I made myself indispensable not by knowing everything, but by consistently providing the right information at the crucial moment. This required building networks of information gathering that extended far beyond my immediate circle. I cultivated relationships with servants in great houses, merchants who traveled between cities, clerks who processed official documents, and scholars who corresponded with colleagues across Europe. Each person saw only a small piece of the larger picture, but I assembled these fragments into comprehensive intelligence. The key principle is selective revelation. I never shared everything I knew with anyone, but I shared something valuable with everyone who could serve my larger strategy. A merchant might receive information about trade route changes that would affect his business. A nobleman might learn about political developments that would impact his standing. A military commander might discover intelligence about enemy movements. Each person received exactly what they needed to make decisions that aligned with my objectives, while remaining unaware of the broader design. They felt grateful for my insights, while unknowingly participating in patterns that served my purposes. I also learned to create information scarcity around myself. Rather than constantly offering updates and opinions, I trained others to come to me when they needed crucial insights. This positioned me as the source of valuable intelligence, rather than just another voice in the crowd. The most sophisticated application involves planting seeds of information that grow into desired conclusions. Over time, instead of directly advocating for a position, I would share relevant facts and observations that would naturally lead others to reach the conclusions I wanted them to reach. They would feel like they had discovered these insights themselves, making their commitment far stronger than if I had simply persuaded them. Remember, The person who shapes what others know shapes what others think, and the person who shapes what others think ultimately shapes what others do. The Knight's Oath scroll in my collection represents one of history's great misconceptions about loyalty. Most leaders believe devotion can be commanded through ceremonies, promises, or declarations. But I discovered that true loyalty must be engineered through psychological architecture, not demanded through ritual. Loyalty cannot be extracted from people. It must be cultivated within them until they feel it as their own authentic choice. The most devoted followers are those who have convinced themselves that your success serves their deepest interests and highest values. I learned this through studying my own patterns of allegiance. When did I feel genuinely loyal to a leader versus merely compliant? The difference was clear. I became truly devoted when I felt that the leader had invested in my personal development, when I believed that their vision aligned with my own aspirations, and when I saw evidence that my contributions mattered to outcomes I cared about. This insight led me to develop what I call the investment principle. People become loyal to those in whom they have invested significant emotional, intellectual, or practical energy. The more someone contributes to your success, the more psychologically committed they become to seeing that success continue. But here's the subtle art. You must create opportunities for others to invest in you without making them feel used or manipulated. The investment must feel voluntary and meaningful. I learned to present challenges and opportunities in ways that allowed others to choose their level of involvement, while ensuring that greater involvement led to greater psychological ownership. I also discovered the power of making people feel chosen rather than merely useful. Anyone can be useful, but being chosen suggests something special about their character or capabilities. When I needed someone's support, I would frame it not as a general request for help, but as recognition of their unique qualifications for this particular contribution. Instead of saying, "I need someone to handle this project," I would say, "I've been thinking about who has the combination of skills and judgment this situation requires, and your name keeps coming to mind." This approach transforms a task into recognition, making the person feel valued rather than simply utilized. The most powerful loyalty is created through shared struggle and mutual risk. When people feel they have overcome challenges alongside you, they develop emotional bonds that transcend simple professional relationships. I learned to include others in my difficulties and uncertainties, not to burden them, but to create opportunities for them to contribute to solutions. This required what I call strategic transparency, sharing enough of your real challenges to make others feel trusted with important information, while maintaining enough reserve to preserve your leadership authority. People need to feel like insiders without feeling like they're responsible for solving everything. I also learned that loyalty requires maintenance through recognition and advancement. People need to see that their devotion produces tangible benefits for their own development and opportunities. Loyalty that doesn't lead to growth eventually transforms into resentment. The ultimate test of engineered loyalty is whether people defend your interests when you're not present. True devotion shows itself not in what people say to your face, but in how they represent your position when others criticize or question your decisions. When you've successfully cultivated this depth of commitment, you'll find that your most loyal followers become your most effective advocates, expanding your influence far beyond your direct reach. The most sophisticated application involves managing multiple reputations simultaneously without creating contradictions that undermine credibility. This requires understanding how different groups communicate with each other and ensuring that various aspects of your reputation can coexist without conflict. I learned to use what I call reputation arbitrage, leveraging strong reputation in one area to build credibility in another. My reputation for political analysis opened doors to discussions about military strategy. My reputation for understanding human nature led to requests for advice about personal relationships. The ultimate goal is creating a reputation that precedes you into every room and creates favorable conditions for whatever you hope to accomplish. When people have heard specific positive things about you before meeting you, they approach interactions with openness and respect that would otherwise take months to earn. Your reputation becomes your advance guard, preparing minds to receive your influence before you ever speak a word. The siege engine in the courtyard below my window reminded me daily that direct assault often strengthens the very defenses you're trying to overcome. I learned that mental resistance operates by similar principles. The harder you push against someone's position, the more firmly they entrench themselves in opposition. This lesson came through painful experience during my early diplomatic career. Faced with stubborn negotiators who rejected my proposals, I would marshal stronger arguments, present more compelling evidence, and apply greater pressure. The result was always the same: increased resistance and deeper entrenchment in their original positions. Everything changed when I began studying resistance itself rather than fighting it. I discovered that opposition isn't usually about the merits of your position, it's about psychological needs that have nothing to do with logic. People resist not because your ideas are wrong, but because accepting them would require admitting error, losing face, or abandoning investments they've already made. I developed what I call the resistance transformation method. Instead of confronting opposition directly, I learned to redirect it toward outcomes that served my purposes. The key insight is that resistance energy can be channeled and utilized rather than simply overcome. When someone opposed my position, I would begin by genuinely seeking to understand the intelligent reasons behind their resistance. This wasn't tactical listening, it was authentic curiosity about their perspective. Most people had never experienced someone seriously examining their objections rather than simply trying to refute them. This approach immediately changed the dynamic. Instead of feeling attacked, they felt heard. Instead of defending, they began explaining. And in explaining their position thoroughly, they often discovered its limitations themselves. I learned that people convince themselves more effectively than you could ever convince them. I also discovered the power of partial agreement. Instead of rejecting their concerns entirely, I would acknowledge the valid elements while introducing new information that shifted the context. You're absolutely right about that concern. And it's actually why I think this alternative approach addresses that issue while also solving these other problems. The most sophisticated technique involves what I call objection adoption. When someone raised a significant concern about my proposal, I would not only acknowledge it, but make it a central part of my revised approach. That's an excellent point that I hadn't fully considered. Let me think about how we could modify this plan to address that issue completely. This response transforms opponents into collaborators because they've now invested their own thinking in improving your idea rather than defeating it. They become psychologically committed to making the solution work because they've contributed to designing it. I learned that the strongest resistance comes from fear of loss rather than absence of gain. People will fight harder to avoid losing something they have than to gain something they want. Therefore, I learned to frame proposals in terms of protecting and preserving what people valued rather than simply offering new benefits. Another crucial insight: resistance often masks deeper concerns that aren't being directly expressed. Someone who objects to your timeline might actually be worried about their competence to deliver. Someone who questions your budget might be concerned about their authority to make such commitments. Address the hidden concern, and the surface objection often dissolves. The ultimate mastery is learning to anticipate resistance before it forms and address underlying concerns before they become conscious objections. When people feel that you've already considered and resolved their potential worries, they approach your proposals with openness rather than skepticism. Remember, The goal isn't to win arguments, but to win minds. And minds change through understanding, not conquest. The treaty seal that once bound nations together taught me that the strongest alliances are built not on legal documents, but on psychological dependencies that make cooperation feel more natural than competition. I discovered that human relationships could be architected like buildings, with careful attention to foundation, structure, and mutual support systems. Most people approach relationships transactionally. What can this person do for me right now? But I learned to think systematically about how individual connections could be woven into networks of mutual benefit that created lasting influence far beyond any single interaction. The key insight is that the most powerful alliances are those where each person's success genuinely contributes to the other's advancement. This isn't mere cooperation, it's interdependence designed so that helping you serves their own interests better than competing with you would. I began mapping the ambitions, resources, and obstacles of everyone in my network. Where did their goals align with mine? Where did they need capabilities I could provide? Where could I help them overcome barriers that were blocking their progress? Most importantly, how could I position myself as essential to their success? This required moving beyond simple quid pro quo arrangements toward what I call compound value creation. Instead of trading favors, I learned to create situations where the same action served multiple people's interests simultaneously. A recommendation that helped one person gain a position also strengthened my relationship with the person making the hiring decision and created gratitude from the person being hired. I discovered that the strongest network positions are created by becoming what I call a connector hub, someone who consistently introduces valuable people to each other. When you become known as the person who helps others build beneficial relationships, everyone wants to maintain their connection with you because you're a source of ongoing opportunity. But the architecture goes deeper than simple networking. I learned to create what I call interlocking dependencies, where multiple relationships reinforce each other. Person A values their relationship with me, partly because it connects them to person B, who values their relationship with me partly because it connects them to person C, who benefits from connections to both A and B. This creates a network effect where the value of each relationship increases as the network grows, and where damaging the relationship with me would cost someone access to multiple other valuable connections. I also learned the importance of managing what I call alliance maintenance. Strong relationships require ongoing investment, but that investment must be strategically distributed. I developed systems for staying meaningfully connected with large numbers of people without overwhelming myself or appearing calculated. Regular but brief touch points, sharing relevant information, making useful introductions, acknowledging their successes, offering assistance during challenges kept relationships active without requiring enormous time investments. The most sophisticated application involves creating influence cascades where your direct relationships multiply your reach through their own networks. When someone you've helped becomes successful, they naturally speak positively about you to their new connections. This extends your reputation and influence into circles you've never directly accessed. I learned to be selective about which alliances to prioritize while maintaining cordial relationships with everyone. Not every connection needs to be deep, but every interaction should leave the other person feeling that you're someone worth knowing better. The ultimate goal is creating a network where your success enhances everyone else's prospects, making your advancement something that others actively support rather than passively tolerate. When helping you succeed becomes the best way for others to achieve their own goals, you've built influence that sustains and grows itself. The court musician's lute taught me that human emotions, like musical notes, can be harmoniously arranged to create desired responses. I discovered that people make their most important decisions based on how they feel in the moment of choice, then use logic afterward to justify what their emotions have already decided. This insight revolutionized my approach to influence. Instead of focusing primarily on logical arguments, I began studying the emotional states that preceded different types of decisions. What feelings led people to take risks? What emotions made them seek security? What moods opened them to new possibilities? And what states made them cling to familiar patterns? I learned that emotions are far more controllable than most people realize, but the control must be subtle and appear natural. Heavy-handed attempts to manipulate feelings create resistance and suspicion. Effective emotional influence feels like the natural flow of human interaction. The foundation is developing what I call emotional literacy, the ability to accurately read the feelings that others are experiencing, including emotions they may not consciously recognize themselves. Most people are surprisingly unaware of their own emotional states and grateful when someone seems to understand what they're experiencing. I learned to observe beyond words and obvious expressions. Posture, breathing patterns, voice tone, energy, levels, and conversation topics all reveal emotional undercurrents. Someone might claim to be excited about a new opportunity while their body language reveals anxiety. Another might insist they're fine with a decision while their voice carries disappointment. Once I could accurately read emotional states, I developed techniques for gradually shifting them toward conditions that supported my objectives. This isn't about creating artificial emotions, but about helping people access feelings that already exist within them. If I needed someone to feel confident about a risky decision, I would guide the conversation toward their past successes and proven capabilities. If I needed them to feel cautious about a proposed change, I would explore potential complications and unintended consequences. If I needed them to feel connected and trusting, I would create opportunities for shared experiences and mutual vulnerability. The key is understanding emotional sequences, how feelings naturally flow from one to another. You cannot instantly transform fear into confidence, but you can move from fear to curiosity, from curiosity to interest, from interest to optimism, and from optimism to confidence. Each transition must feel natural and voluntary. I discovered that certain emotions make people more receptive to influence, while others create resistance. Gratitude, curiosity, hope, and feeling valued open minds to new possibilities. Fear, anger, shame, and feeling pressured close minds and trigger defensive responses. The most powerful technique involves what I call emotional mirroring and leading. I would first match the emotional state the other person was experiencing, demonstrating that I understood and accepted their feelings. Once this connection was established, I could gradually model the emotional state I wanted them to experience, and they would naturally follow. I also learned that emotional states are contagious in ways that most people don't consciously recognize. Your own emotional state significantly influences how others feel in your presence. If you remain calm during crisis, others become more composed. If you project confidence during uncertainty, others feel more secure. If you demonstrate genuine enthusiasm for an idea, others become more interested. The most sophisticated application involves creating what I call emotional architecture around important decisions. Instead of presenting choices at random moments, I learned to engineer circumstances that would put people in optimal emotional states for making the decisions I hoped they would make. Remember, logic may change minds, but emotion moves hearts, and hearts ultimately drive the actions that matter. The court jester's mask hanging in my chamber reminds me daily that perception shapes reality more powerfully than facts ever could. I learned that the same event can be interpreted as triumph or disaster, wisdom or folly, strength, or weakness, depending entirely on how it's framed and presented to human minds. This revelation came during my darkest period of exile, when I watched former colleagues rewrite the history of my political tenure. Events that had been celebrated as diplomatic victories were now described as failures of judgment. Decisions that had been praised for their strategic wisdom were reinterpreted as evidence of dangerous ambition. Nothing about the actual events had changed, but the narrative surrounding them had been completely transformed. I realized that whoever controls the frame controls the meaning, and whoever controls the meaning controls the response. I began studying how perceptions form and how they can be deliberately shaped. Most people assume that others see situations objectively, but I discovered that human perception is incredibly malleable and constantly influenced by context, timing, and presentation. The same proposal can be seen as innovative or reckless depending on how it's introduced. The same person can appear confident or arrogant based on the setting where you encounter them. The same outcome can feel like success or failure depending on what expectations were established beforehand. I developed what I call the frame-setting principle. Before presenting any idea, situation, or even myself, I learned to establish the context that would lead others to interpret everything that followed in terms favorable to my objectives. If I needed a proposal to seem prudent rather than aggressive, I would first discuss the dangers of inaction and the costs of missed opportunities. If I needed a decision to appear bold rather than reckless, I would establish the context of competitive pressures and the rewards that come to those who act decisively. The most powerful framing occurs before people realize they're being influenced. I learned to embed my preferred interpretations in casual conversation, background information, and seemingly unrelated observations that would later shape how people understood more direct communications. I also discovered the principle of contrast. Manipulation, the same option appears more or less attractive depending on what it's compared to. By controlling the alternatives that people consider, I could make my preferred choice seem obviously superior without needing to oversell its benefits. If I wanted someone to accept a moderate proposal, I would first present a more extreme option. That would make the moderate approach seem reasonable and balanced. If I wanted them to appreciate a generous offer, I would ensure they understood what a minimal offer would look like. The most sophisticated application involves what I call reality construction, creating comprehensive narratives that help people make sense of complex situations in ways that support your objectives. This isn't about lying or distorting facts, but about selecting and emphasizing the elements of truth that lead to your preferred conclusions. Every situation contains multiple valid interpretations. The skilled practitioner identifies which interpretation serves their purposes and then provides the evidence, context, and reasoning that makes this interpretation feel natural and convincing to others. I learned that people desperately want to understand what's happening around them, and they're grateful to anyone who provides a coherent explanation that makes sense of confusing circumstances. By becoming the person who helps others interpret events, you become the person who shapes their understanding of reality itself. The ultimate mastery involves making your version of events become the accepted truth, not through force or repetition, but by making it the most compelling and complete explanation available. When your interpretation helps people understand their world better than any alternative, they adopt it as their own and defend it against competing narratives. Remember, in human affairs, the story that makes the most sense becomes the truth. That guides action, regardless of what actually happened. The town crier's bell that once commanded the attention of entire crowds taught me that group psychology operates by fundamentally different rules than individual influence. I discovered that people in groups think, feel, and behave in ways that would be completely foreign to them as individuals. And this transformation creates both tremendous opportunities and significant dangers. My first lesson in mass psychology came during the tumultuous period when the Medici were expelled from Florence. I watched as reasonable, intelligent citizens became swept up in collective emotions that overrode their individual judgment. People who were normally cautious became reckless. Those who were typically compassionate became cruel. The moderate became extreme. I realized that group identity temporarily suppresses individual identity, creating a psychological state where people become more susceptible to certain types of influence while becoming resistant to others. The techniques that work with individuals often fail completely with groups, while approaches that seem crude for individual influence can be devastatingly effective with crowds. The key insight is that groups develop their own emotional atmosphere that becomes stronger than any individual member's personal feelings. Once this collective emotion reaches a certain intensity, it becomes self-reinforcing and begins to shape the thoughts and actions of everyone within its influence. I learned to identify the early signs of collective emotional states, the subtle shifts in energy, attention, and responsiveness that indicate when a group is becoming psychologically unified. These moments create windows of extraordinary influence, but they require different approaches than individual persuasion. Groups respond to symbols, stories, and spectacle more than logic or detailed argument. The same message that would need careful explanation for an individual can be communicated to a group through a single, powerful image or dramatic gesture. Complexity confuses groups, but simplicity galvanizes them. I discovered that groups have natural leaders who emerge from within the collective rather than being imposed from outside. These individuals don't control the group so much as they embody its emerging direction. The most effective way to influence a group is often to influence these natural leaders, who amplify your message through their established credibility with the collective dot. But the real power lies in understanding social proof and momentum. Groups look to each other for cues about how to think and behave. When you can create the impression that an idea or action is already gaining acceptance within the group, others will naturally follow to avoid being left behind. I learned techniques for seeding ideas throughout a group so that they appear to emerge spontaneously from multiple sources rather than being promoted by a single person. When the same concept seems to be occurring to different people independently, it feels like natural consensus rather than coordinated influence. The most sophisticated application involves what I call cascade engineering, creating conditions where small changes in group opinion trigger larger shifts that eventually transform the entire collective perspective. Like a carefully placed stone that starts an avalanche, the right intervention at the right moment can redirect an entire group's trajectory. I also learned the importance of timing in group influence. Groups have periods of stability when they resist change and periods of transition when they're open to new directions. Major influence attempts should be timed to coincide with these natural moments of openness, rather than trying to force change during stable periods. The ultimate goal is making your ideas feel like they belong to the group itself, rather than being imposed from outside. When a collective believes it has discovered something rather than been taught something, their commitment becomes unshakable and their advocacy becomes unstoppable. Mass psychology is perhaps the most powerful force in human affairs, but it requires respectful understanding rather than cynical manipulation. Groups can create magnificent achievements or terrible destruction, depending on how their collective energy is channeled. The Renaissance crown resting in my study represents not the authority over others that I once sought, but the sovereignty over oneself that I finally achieved. After decades of studying power, influence, and human nature, I can tell you that the greatest victory is not controlling others, but becoming the master of your own mind and character. Everything I have shared with you about influencing others ultimately serves a higher purpose, developing yourself into the kind of person that others naturally want to follow, trust, and support. The techniques are tools, but your character is the foundation that gives those tools meaning and legitimacy. I have seen leaders who mastered every manipulation technique but destroyed themselves through lack of self-discipline. I have watched brilliant strategists fail because they never learned to control their own emotions and impulses. I have observed charismatic influencers lose everything because they used their abilities to serve their ego rather than worthy purposes. True influence requires what I call ethical power, the ability to guide others toward outcomes that genuinely serve their interests as well as your own. This isn't weakness or compromise. It's the recognition that sustainable influence must be built on mutual benefit rather than exploitation. The responsibility that comes with these capabilities is profound. When you can shape how others think and feel, you become accountable for the directions in which you guide them. Use these abilities to help people become better versions of themselves, to solve problems that matter, and to create value that extends beyond your immediate interests. Remember that the most effective influence is often invisible. When you have truly mastered these principles, people will feel that their best decisions were entirely their own. Their finest insights came from their own wisdom, and their strongest motivations arose from their own values. They will be grateful for your presence in their lives without being able to explain exactly why. The ultimate test of your development is not how much control you can exercise over others, but how much others benefit from their interactions with you. Do people leave conversations with you feeling more confident, more clear about their direction, more capable of achieving their goals? Do they make better decisions because of your influence? Do they become more successful, more fulfilled, more effective in their own spheres? If you can answer yes to these questions, then you have achieved something far greater than mere influence. You have developed the capacity to elevate everyone around you while advancing your own legitimate objectives. My final counsel to you is this: use these principles to become the kind of person you would want to follow. Create the standards you would want others to maintain. Demonstrate the character you would want to see in those who influence you, the prince or princess of their own mind needs no crown, no title, no external validation. They carry their authority within themselves, express it through their actions, and share it by helping others discover their own capacity for excellence. This is my legacy to you, not just the knowledge of how minds can be moved, but the wisdom to move them toward light rather than darkness, toward growth rather than diminishment, toward truth rather than deception. Go now and become the influence you wish to see in the world.